Imagine a glass skyscraper in the middle of a thunderstorm where the wind is screaming at 100 miles an hour and the lightning is clawing at the windows. But inside the penthouse, the air is perfectly still and a single candle flame does not even flicker. This is the story of Elias, a man who once lived like a raw nerve exposed to the world, where every cold breeze of a comment or every spark of a sideways glance would set his entire soul on fire. Elias was the kind of person who checked his email at 3 a.m. and felt his heart hammer against his ribs because a client had used a period instead of an exclamation mark. He lived in a state of constant biological emergency, always braced for the next impact, and always ready to bleed for people who didn't even know his middle name. One Tuesday afternoon, Elias stood in a crowded subway car when a man in a tattered coat deliberately stepped on his polished shoes, and then looked him dead in the eye and called him a pathetic piece of corporate filth. In that microsecond, the ancient machinery of Elias's brain ignited, and his amygdala sent a scream of adrenaline through his veins that made his hands shake and his vision narrow into a dark tunnel of pure rage. He wanted to roar back, and he wanted to prove his worth by crushing this stranger with words or fists, but he felt a cold hand touch his shoulder and heard a voice whisper to wait. Sitting on the bench was an old man with eyes like polished obsidian, who was watching the scene not with fear or excitement, but with the clinical curiosity of a biologist watching a cell divide under a microscope. The old man gestured for Elias to sit as the aggressor continued to shout, and the old man asked a question that changed everything when he asked why Elias was choosing to work for a man who clearly hated himself. He explained that every time Elias got angry, he was signing a contract to become that stranger's unpaid employee because he was doing the emotional labor of processing the stranger's internal trash. The old man told him that anger is not an expression of power, but a confession of a leak in the soul, where you admit to the world that your peace is so cheap it can be bought with a single insult. Elias looked at the shouting man, and for the first time he didn't see an enemy, but he saw a broken machine that was leaking black oil everywhere and realized that he didn't have to step in the puddle. This was the beginning of Elias's journey into the architecture of silence and the law, realization that the most dangerous weapon in the human arsenal is not a sharp tongue, but a steady pulse. Most people spend their entire lives as puppets with 1,000 strings attached to their limbs, and they give the end of those strings to everyone they meet, including the barista who forgets their order or the driver who cuts them off. We are taught by a reactive society that anger is a sign of strength or a defense of honor, but in reality, anger is a biological surrender where you hand the remote control of your nervous system to an idiot. The first step Elias had to learn was the concept of the sovereign gap, which is that sacred space between a stimulus and your response, where your humanity actually resides. Animals have no gap, because if you poke a dog, it barks, and if you strike a horse, it kicks, because they are biological machines running on a loop of pure reflex. But a human being has the unique evolutionary privilege of standing in that gap and deciding whether or not a stimulus even deserves the energy of a response. Elias began to practice a technique called clinical detachment, where he stopped looking at insults as weapons and started looking at them as data points about the speaker's own mental health. When his boss would belittle his work, Elias would breathe and realize that his boss was not talking about the report, but was actually projecting his own fear of inadequacy onto a convenient target. He realized that when someone attacks you, they are actually attempting a data transfer of their own misery because they cannot handle the weight of their own internal decay. They are looking for a host, and they are looking for a person who is stable enough to carry their poison for them because they are too weak to digest it themselves. If you get angry, the upload is complete, and you have successfully become a landfill for someone else's psychological garbage, which is the ultimate form of self-betrayal. Elias learned to hack his own biology using the physiological sigh, which is a double inhale through the nose, and a long, slow exhale that forces the heart rate to drop instantly. By controlling his breath, he was telling his primitive brain that there was no saber-toothed tiger in the room, and that the shouting person was just a noisy primate with a temporary chemical imbalance. As Elias grew more skilled, he adopted the practice of asymmetrical agreement, which is a way of taking the wind out of an attacker's sails by simply agreeing with their most vicious points. When a rival at work told him he was cold and calculating, Elias didn't defend himself, because defense is a subtle way of asking for permission to exist. Instead, he looked the rival in the eye with a mask of polite indifference and said that his observation was correct and that his focus was indeed on results rather than social approval. The rival had no script for this because he was expecting a fight, and he was expecting Elias to offer up his neck by trying to prove he was a nice person. By owning the trait, the rival tried to weaponize Elias, became a ghost in the social hierarchy, because you cannot shame a man who has already walked through his own shadow. He realized that the ego is a giant target painted on the chest, and the more you care about your reputation, the more surface area you give the world to strike. Elias began a process of ego attrition, where he stripped away the need to be seen as smart or kind or successful, and instead focused on the internal reality of being immovable. He thought of Marcus Aurelius, who looked at the imperial purple robes and reminded himself they were just sheep's wool soaked in the blood of a shellfish. Elias looked at the insults thrown his way and saw them as nothing more than vibrating air molecules that had no power to change the chemical composition of his blood unless he allowed it. He understood that true dominance in the animal kingdom is not the one who makes the most noise, but the one who remains the most still while the world around them panics. A lion does not roar at a fly because the lion knows its own nature, and the lion does not need the fly to acknowledge its status as a predator. When you react to a fool, you are essentially getting down on all fours to bark back at a dog to prove you are the boss of the street, which only proves you have forgotten you are a human. Elias spent months refining this inner citadel until he was no longer avoiding conflict, but was instead becoming a void where conflict went to die. One day, a former friend who had betrayed him came to his office to deliver a final stinging rebuke meant to shatter Elias's composure in front of his peers. The man shouted, and he brought up old wounds, and he used every dark psychology trick in the book to try and get Elias to blink or flush red with shame. Elias sat there with his hands folded and his facial muscles entirely slack, watching the man with the same mild interest one might have for a weather report in a city they don't live in. He executed the double inhale and felt the cool air hit his lungs, and he watched the man's jugular vein pulse with rage, and he felt a profound sense of clinical pity. He asked himself how horrific the man's internal monologue must be if this was the only way he knew how to interact with the world. When the man finally stopped and stood there panting and waiting for the explosion, Elias simply asked if there was anything else he needed to get off his chest before the meeting started. The man looked around the room and realized that he was the only one who had lost control, and he was the only one who looked weak, and he was the only one who was burning his own energy. Elias had turned the man's own momentum against him by providing no resistance and letting the man collapse under the weight of his own theatrical tantrum. This is the secret of the economy of provocation, where you realize that your attention is a currency, and you are the most elitist snob in the world with how you spend it. Most people are emotional beggars who walk around with their hands out, asking for a reaction so they can feel a temporary spark of relevance. If you give them your anger, you are funding their bankruptcy, and you are subsidizing their inability to regulate their own minds. Elias became a master of the long game because he realized that the most dangerous people on earth are not the ones with bad tempers, but the ones with chilling patience. Anger is a burst of energy that leaves you hollow and depleted, but the silence of a detached mind is a reservoir of power that can be deployed with surgical precision. He began to see the world as a series of investments, and he asked himself if an argument was worth the cortisol spike that would take hours to clear from his system. He decided that 99% of human interactions are not worth the neurochemical cost of a response, and he chose to stay wealthy in his own peace. The deeper Elias went into this dark psychological immunity, the more he realized that people were actually afraid of his calm. They knew how to deal with a man who shouts back because they could predict his moves and they could trigger his buttons. But they had no map for a man who looked through them, as if they were made of glass, and who smiled with a genuine but distant kindness while they tried to burn his house down. Elias realized that by killing his ego, he had become a ghost, and you cannot stab a ghost, and you cannot set fire to the air. He began to train his mind to see insults as gifts of practice, where every rude comment was a weight in the gym of his soul that helped him build more emotional muscle. He stopped wishing for a world without toxic people and started wishing for a mind that was so well-armored that toxicity simply slid off him like water off a raven's wing. The old man from the subway appeared in his thoughts again, reminding him that the ultimate form of revenge is to be unlike the person who performed the injury. If you become angry at a monster, you have allowed the monster to reproduce inside of you, and you have given it a second life in your own heart. Elias chose to let the monsters die of starvation by refusing to feed them with his focus or his resentment. He learned that forgiveness is not a favor you do for the other person, but it is a selfish act of clearing your own internal hard drive, so you have more room for your own goals. He lived by the rule that if a person does not have the life he wants, or a mind he respects, their opinion of him is mathematically irrelevant. This realization acted as a filter that blocked out the noise of the crowd and allowed him to hear the quiet frequency of his own purpose. Elias was no longer a victim of his environment, but the architect of his internal reality who could stand in the middle of a riot and feel the same peace as if he were in a library. He understood that the world will always try to pull you down into the mud because misery loves company and the weak are threatened by the self-controlled. But he also knew that once you have tasted the freedom of being unbothered, the petty games of the world look like children fighting over broken toys. He looked back at his old self, the man who stayed awake at night, rehearsing arguments, and he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the silence he had earned. The transformation was complete when he realized that the loudest person in the room is usually the most fragile, and the quietest person is usually the most prepared. Elias walked through the world with a hidden smile because he knew a secret that most people would never understand. He knew that your emotions are the only things you truly own, and to give them away for free is the greatest tragedy a human can experience. He chose to keep his treasure locked away in a vault of discipline, where only those he deemed worthy could ever catch a glimpse of his true heart. For everyone else he was a mirror reflecting their own chaos back at them, and a void that swallowed their aggression without a trace. The story of Elias is a roadmap for the modern soul, which is constantly under siege by digital and physical provocations designed to steal our focus. We must build our own iron citadels, and we must forge our own immunity if we are to survive with our sanity intact. Every morning, Elias would look in the mirror and remind himself that today people will be ungrateful and aggressive and short-sighted, and that it has nothing to do with him. He accepted the nature of humanity as it is not as he wished it to be, and in that acceptance he found an unbreakable shield. He stopped being a participant in the drama of others and became a witness to the play of life, which allowed him to act with wisdom instead of reacting with fear. If you can master the art of feeling absolutely nothing when someone is trying to destroy you, then you have reached a level of power that no king or dictator can ever take away. You become the master of your own destiny and the captain of your own soul, standing firm while the waves of the world break harmlessly against your feet. The journey to this state is long, and it requires the brutal honesty of looking at your own insecurities and pulling them out by the roots. But the reward is a life of such profound clarity and strength that you will wonder how you ever lived any other way. Elias sat in the same subway car a year later and another man bumped into him and began to curse and scream about the space Elias was taking up. Elias didn't even look up from his book, but he simply shifted his weight to give the man more room and felt his heart beating at a steady 60 beats per minute. The man shouted louder, trying to get a reaction, but Elias was already miles away in a world of his own making, where the man's voice was just the sound of a distant wind. As the man got off the train, he looked back at Elias with a face full of confusion and defeat, because he knew he had failed to exist in Elias's world. Elias turned the page and continued to read, knowing that he had won a battle without ever having to draw a sword. This is the path of the deep mind, and it is the only path to true sovereignty in a world that is obsessed with noise. If you are ready to stop being a puppet and start being the architect of your own peace, then you have found the right place to begin your training. The world will keep trying to trigger you, but now you know that the trigger only works if you provide the gunpowder. Empty your mind of the need for validation and fill it with the solid gold of self-possession, and you will become untouchable. Thank you for walking through this story of Elias and for choosing to take control of your psychological hardware. If you want to dive deeper into these hidden methods of the human psyche, please subscribe to my channel Deep Mind Portal.